Welcome to the second half of Chapter 24 as we wrap things up. So when we left things off, we talked about this idea of the biological species concept as our default species concept, where we look at is a group of individuals reproductively isolated from others, and use that to determine if it's a species. If it's isolated, species. If it's not a species. You might classify them instead as being breeds or subspecies, something along those lines. Now, there's two main problems with the biological species concept that don't allow us to use it all the time. So we can't solely have one species concept. And that comes down to, with the biological species concept, you have to be able to see if two things could breed together. So if they're fossilized, if they no longer are alive, I can't see if they can successfully breed together. So we can't take like a Neanderthal fossil and go ahead and put him in with Homo heidelbergensis, I believe you'd say, and then like put them in a room together with their fossils, and I don't know, like throw some alcohol in there and turn on the mood music and see if we get some type of weird hybrid. It's impossible. So with fossils, we cannot use the biological species concept. The organism has to be living if we're to see what would happen. The other issue is you have to be sexually reproducing so we can see if the populations can intermix. So if it's an asexual organism, which would be pretty much all prokaryotes, so they're kind of already off this, but there are some other organisms that would fall more into the animal category that do use this method, or even like fungus, like yeast and such. They would essentially be removed if they primarily, or especially if they exclusively, reproduce asexually. If you're wondering what this symbol is, it's the symbol for asexuals amongst people, because apparently there are people that don't have sex because they are not having any desire to. That's opposed to what most of us have, which is a lack of opportunity. So this is the symbol that they have, and apparently it's like, I want to say 5 or 10% of the population ultimately would fall into this asexual group. So that's kind of something you're seeing rise up now as people discuss it more, as people that just don't really care. Now, other species concepts, this will include 3 that we'll briefly discuss. So if we have to throw out the biological species concept sometimes, not always, it's our preferred, but if it's something that's dead, something that is asexual, we have to have something else to fall back on. So the first species concept that really was commonly used, and the one that we still probably fall back on most when we have stuff like fossils and even asexual stuff, is the morphological species concept. And so this one just looks at the physical structures that they possess, so anatomy, and tries to decide, are those physical structures different enough that it warrants being a new species? Now, this one tends to inflate the number of species, because we tend to see where, let's say we have a Chihuahua, and we've got a Labrador Retriever and a Great Dane. If we found all of those guys in the fossil record, we'd probably look at them and say, whoa, those are way different in size. Some of the proportions in the body are very different, especially if it's like a Dachshund or something, like a wiener dog. You'd look at that guy going like, I don't know what's going on. And so we would likely classify each of those as its own species, when in reality they can all interbreed. And so this doesn't always account for organisms that have a lot of polymorphisms within them. We'd still be able to find them in the fossil record, but we really just have to be careful about whether they're a juvenile of another, the same species essentially. You have to be very careful if there's something else going on. But this is still the one we probably fall back on most, where we look at things and say, all right, this has different bone structure, or an extra bone, or the head is kind of rearranged, or there's like a hole or something else in a different spot. So we're going to say it's a new species. That's morphological. Ecological tries to focus on what the organism does in its environment, its niche. So where it lives, what it eats, those types of characteristics, its role that it has. And if it has a different role, it pretty much says new species. So with Darwin's finches, this would work out well, where even if they looked fairly similar overall, in some cases, even if they interbred, if we could see that they tended to live in different areas, one eats worms and it's basically going around doing that. Another one is eating fruits. So ecologically, they're very different. And so if they're different ecologically, we'd say new species. That vampire finch in this case would be a different species because it does something ecologically different than the other ones. Its niche overlaps somewhat with perhaps the nectar drinking, but the vampiric aspect would kind of put it in a different group most likely, so we'd say that's a new species based upon ecological. And then lastly, one of the kind of oddest ones for me is the phylogenetic, where if you look at a phylogenetic tree, and this one's a relatively like broad one, we're doing big groups here, but if you kept going and going, you'd eventually get these small, like the tiniest branches at the end. And so whichever guys end up on those smallest branches, you say that's a species. Now this can be tricky because it's fairly subjective as to what those final branches should be. But the nice thing about it is because this one doesn't say it has to strictly be about ecology, or it has to strictly be about reproduction, or it has to be strictly about anatomy, with the phylogenetic species concept, we have quite a lot of leeway to use lots of different evidences, be it molecular, anatomical, what they eat, their niche, so ecological, or reproductive. All that can come into play as we try and decide, does this one deserve to have its own little branch, or does it belong on somebody else's branch? And so that part is kind of nice that it gives us more room to kind of work with, because sometimes when you talk about stuff like the biological species concept, you get some things like dogs and wolves that occasionally do interbreed. You know, they're more than capable of it, even in the wild sometimes. And so it gets very odd where in most cases you look at those two saying, yeah, those guys shouldn't be in the same, general branch there. But if you're using purely the reproductive idea, they do reproduce. I mean, it has happened quite a bit. It's not the default. They're probably going to pick a wolf well before a dog. But it does happen enough that it makes it odd as to what we should do with that. And so this one allows us to really use a lot of different evidences, but it's still one of the more subjective ones, which a lot of scientists don't like because it just gives them a lot of room to argue. Because then they get to, each take their own stance and provide evidence, and they might both have evidence. And then we just get busy listening to them arguing. Now, for speciation, there's two general, pathways, modes of speciation that we're going to discuss. And those are allopatric and sympatric. Allopatric is the most obvious, the simplest. This is like where a volcano or a mountain arises, and so it separates two populations. It could be that there is a fault. It could be that there's a river. Something separates these two populations, a road, a fence, and so they cannot intermingle because they're geographically, physically kept separate. And so that allows for reproductive isolation. So each group, each population can now evolve in its own direction, so we can get this divergence. And then eventually, if they come back together, they may be different enough that they don't look at each other and think sexy time like we talked about before. They look at each other and see someone who's more just a competitor. They see someone that is, in some cases, I guess, maybe prey. That'd be kind of extreme, but they don't see someone that they would want to mate with. And so at that point, we would have speciation by our default concept. And so geographic isolation allowed for reproductive isolation. The other way is sympatric, where speciation occurs kind of within the bigger population, within the parent population. So you have a small subgroup that forms, and that small subgroup is separated by usually something like prezygotic. So it might be that they start reproducing at a different time. It might be that they move into a slightly new location, so they go up in the trees, but still in the same area. It could be that they have, I don't remember if I did different mating call, but we'll see. So it could be like different mating call or something, behavioral, mating dance changed. Maybe one group wants you to build them a nest and the other group doesn't. And so something allows for reproductive isolation to occur, even though they're still technically in the same geographic space. And then as this isolation occurs over a prolonged period of time, you can then get to the point that even if they were to kind of like migrate back, so let's say one was up in the trees, one's on the ground, they go through this long process of divergence, and then eventually something happens and some of the guys from the trees come back down to the ground. If that happened, the key thing here is they would not recognize each other as being potential mates. They've differed enough that they no longer can look at each other and think that this individual is exactly like me. They typically will see something more like a competitor. Okay, speciation tempo. So we've reached the end here of 24. When people first thought about evolution, they thought of it as what they call gradualism, where this process of everything slowly changing. And you've seen this with a lot of stuff where there's like this gradual morphing of stuff, whether it's from a little monkey-like guy to a person, whether it's from a fish to an amphibian to a reptile. We'll probably watch one of these in class just because they're fun to kind of see the overall switch. But there's a lot of these ideas that was slow and steady, that it was essentially the tortoise. But oftentimes in the fossil record, we'll see that big events happen geologically, so there's big environmental change, and things have to adapt rapidly or they go extinct, they die off. And so we see that this speciation, this switch, doesn't happen nice and gradual. You can see this slow shift out. It happens very rapidly, and then it can oftentimes stay pretty much the same. The organism can kind of stay put for a long time. You know, aardvarks have been very similar to aardvarks, these anteater guys, for like 50, 60 million years. Horseshoe crabs have been doing the horseshoe crab thing for like 200 and some million years. And so there are some organisms that appear to kind of, I'm sure their immune system and such is evolving, but on the whole, they're staying pretty steady. They're pretty much staying as they are. They're napping, if we're using the hair analogy, for quite a while, where they're not doing any drastic changes because nothing's forcing them to. There's no drastic selective pressure being applied that forces them to quickly alter how they are. And then when something does happen, that's when you see these quick bursts, these quick shifts. And so this happens frequently, where we'll see like a mass extinction, then rapid speciation. But then things kind of steady out and get stable, and then things kind of go like they are for a little bit oftentimes. And then something might happen, a little ice age, something, mixes things up, and then we'll start to see this other burst of evolution because the guys that don't get moving too quickly at that point die off. So there is still some aspect, I guess, of gradualism where we're all slowly adapting just with our immune system and such. We have to cope or else we're screwed. So on a molecular level, there's always going to be some, but we don't see consistent rates of speciation. We don't see consistent rates of change. We see where change is slow and steady and then oftentimes picks up and goes rapid and then slows back down slow and steady and picks back up rapidly. And so that is called punctuated equilibrium. So when you see me talk about punctuated equilibrium, this is the idea that we're talking about. It's this more stop and go versus steady, steady, steady all the time. That's it for chapter 24, guys. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon.